I should probably say buongiorno. I speak a lot more Spanish than Italian, I'm sorry. But grazie for having me. So I'm at heart an engineer, but now I mainly run engineering teams. So since the end of last year, I've been leading the mobile team at Automatic, where we mainly focus on the WordPress apps. It's like a 25-person team, so my job's got super meta, and I manage managers now. So when people talk about engineering management, they talk about herding cats. So I found this quote on being an engineering manager. A man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. But Mark Twain's a little dated. You know, women can traumatize cats too now. And I really like to think about raccoons rather than cats, though, because raccoons are cuter, smarter, and much more inclined to wash things. But, you know, like cats, raccoons do what they feel. And sometimes that's awesome. So look at this raccoon riding a crocodile. I admire this raccoon so much. She's just like everything I want to be in life. And sometimes it's not. So like this raccoon is stuck. Poor little guy. But this raccoon is really trying to live his best life. He is trying to break into a tank. Right? It's just pretty hard to break into a tank, and so now he's stuck. And maybe all he needed was someone to say to him, like, hey buddy, I get that you want to drive a tank. Obviously that would be awesome. But that hole is pretty small, so have you thought about riding a crocodile instead? So when I was prepping for this talk earlier this year, I had some doubts about whether it was going to be the right kind of talk for mobile developer conferences. You know, I bet you all get to write a lot more code than I do. So please come and find me later and tell me what that's like, because I really miss it. But do something with me. If you have had a good manager, can you please stand up? All right. And if you've been part of a high-performing team, please stand up. Okay. All right. Good. No, stay standing up. All right. If that has been the norm, stay standing up. Otherwise sit down. Okay. All right. Well, congratulations, those of you standing up. You maybe don't need this talk, but I promise you there's a lot more of these raccoon slides, and I do believe it's worth staying for those alone. But the rest of you, this talk is for you, because we work in a pretty dysfunctional industry, and it can be really hard to find great teams and healthy work environments. And that's even harder when we don't really know what that looks like. I know for myself, I didn't really get to be part of an inclusive team until I ran one. And you know, we make better decisions when we go towards something that we believe to be good than when we go away from something that we know is bad. So I kind of hope that I can give you some ideas of things to look for in the next team that you join, and some things that you can push for on the teams that you're currently on. So there are a lot of think pieces on the internet that will offer you a silver bullet to fix your mobile engineering team. And the two silver bullets that we often find are 1, React Native, and 2, product pods, right? You read some of these think pieces. But let's just take a moment and talk about why React Native is probably not the answer to whatever problems your mobile team currently faces. I mean, it might be if your problem is that you need to write very standard UI code on iOS a little bit faster. Because, you know, performance problems, especially on Android when you build anything native, anything complex. But the thing about React Native is that it is a technical solution to a social problem. And it turns out that the social problems of Facebook aren't normally found outside of Facebook. So I'm not going to offer you any silver bullets today, but I am going to talk about predictability, prioritization, connectedness, automation, and accountability. So a predictable team has a regular cadence. You know, you can set goals and expectations around when things will ship. But the challenge on mobile is that we ship compiled code. And most advice about improving team velocity talks about continuous delivery, right? It's like just ship constantly, as many times a day as you can, and like roll back if you need to, and like, lol, don't we all have a story about how we once broke prod because YOLO, you know? Right? But it's not quite as simple in the App Store, right? An early build of the like much anticipated Gmail for iOS broke notifications. It popped up this error message constantly, and it had to be pulled from the store. So I worked next to that team at the time, and I remember this like viscerally. And things have really improved since 2011, you know? We have better continuous integration, we know which build is signed with which certificate, and the App Store's improved too, right? Wait times are lower, you can expedite an emergency bug fix. Google Play has had staged rollout for a while, and we finally got it this year on iOS, so yay, although it's really not as good. But you can't roll back an app in the iTunes Store or on Google Play. With auto update, it's easy to think that everybody gets the latest version, but this is just not true. People can turn it off, they can just be selective about when they update, or they can just go several days without connecting to Wi-Fi. You know, we really have to remember that the typical tech worker with high-speed internet at work and at home, they're not our typical user. And so the worst case scenario has got less bad, but ultimately it remains the same, because there is no, lol, that time I broke pod for 2 minute story, right? There is a frantic patch and test and release cycle, and the impatient waiting, and in the time that takes, the vitriolic reviews from apps, from users that you would never otherwise hear from, right? Reviews that suggest everyone on the team should be fired, or even offer physical violence. All reviews that I've seen on things that I've worked on. So one small mistake, several hours to fix, and then months of trying to rebuild your star rating. So a regular cadence is really at the core of a predictable mobile team, but this is not just about the decision to ship on whatever cadence, but everything that goes into that. So how do you build confidence in that release? Automated testing, manual QA, internal users, and do they actually use the app and tell you what they find? Beta users who you then actually need to talk to. And can you commit to the release train, right? Because the thing that will most easily derail your release cycle is trying to stick things into it because you don't want to wait until the next release. And so this is why an effective release cycle is 1, short, and 2, rigid. Short because people are more willing to wait if they don't have to wait long, and rigid because patching things in and hoping for the best will result in a delayed and buggy release. You might get away with it once or twice, but you won't get away with it every time, and when you break these rules, you undermine them. And finally, you have to be willing to kick things off the release train. And feature flags help with this, but really it's about being willing to say about the feature that is causing problems in the alpha, or FSM forbid the beta, this is not ready yet, and it's going to have to wait for next time. So a common complaint about mobile teams is that they're slower, and mainly I don't think this is about how the writing of code is slower, but that releasing it to the world is. Because even with a very rigid 2-week release cycle, code can be around for up to a month before it finally goes out in the world. A PR review takes a little time, it misses the release train, you've got another 2 weeks to wait. So a regular release cycle means that you can communicate that changes will be out, and that people will, like leadership and users will kind of see improvements regularly. So they'll be more willing to wait and believe that their improvement is coming, even if it hasn't come yet. I don't really believe in deadlines. I believe in prioritization, scope, and regular releases. But I do believe in goals. An effective team can set themselves goals and meet them. It's hard to achieve goals surrounded by chaos, though, which is why the predictability of a regular release cycle helps. And beyond that, prioritizing what's most important and why, and scoping, what's a unit of measurable improvement, really do go a long way. And these things are not rocket science, but they require much of the same discipline as, making your release cycle regular, being committed to the realistic, and being willing to say no. So when you ask people what's most important and why, they can answer if your team is clear on priorities, which most teams probably aren't. And the problem that we have on mobile is that leadership is often dominated by iOS users, so Android can end up feeling like an afterthought. But if you ask a person on your team what your top priority is as a team, can they tell you? Can they tell you why? Can they talk about how their work fits into it, or if it doesn't? Do your actions and the actions of leadership around you align with that top priority? And do your team priorities align with your company priorities? And the challenge of team priorities is often not deciding what they should be, but deciding what should come first and being consistent in your actions so that they align with that. Now, a sustainable product has both growth and retention, right? But because mobile is growing and desktop is stagnating, your mobile experience, and this includes the web too, needs to effectively onboard new users. But app downloads are declining, right? The era of there's an app for that is over. It's like, of course there's an app for that, but does it merit the space that it takes up on my phone? Your regular app users are your most engaged users. They've really made it past onboarding. They've figured out what it's for. And how do you maintain that engagement? Now, different products have different priorities, but it's important to consider both your new user experience and your existing user experience. Over time, to be sustainable, you need to be balancing both. If you onboard people into a bad experience, they will leave and you will never get them back. But you do need to focus on your onboarding experience in order to grow. So there's 2 apps that I've abandoned for cause. Has anybody else abandoned some apps for cause? Yeah? Just me? I'm just like an irrationally angry person. Okay, I have a friend. We'll talk later. So Nike Fuel and Duolingo. So they're both gamification apps, right? And the same thing happened with both of them. They lost my streak, and I was annoyed. The Nike Fuel had a hardware failure, and Duolingo kind of saved the state badly after I got unexpectedly disconnected from the internet. And actually, another example of that is the WordPress app. Like a long time before I worked at Automatic, I lost a blog post on it that I was writing on my iPad, and I just gave up writing in it altogether and started using the Notes app instead. People complain a lot. Technology is fallible, but whatever your product, you need to understand what your UX catastrophe is. For a writing app, it is absolutely content loss. And for a gamification app, I'd say it's unfair losing. So what comes first is a fine balance between company, team, and the various possible focuses. New users, existing users, money, or growth. There can only be one top priority, but that doesn't mean that the team only works on one thing. Every team has to balance maintenance and feature work, and you can't usually say no to everything other than number 1, but you need to say no enough that number 1 actually happens. And priorities need to be communicated frequently with reasons and with progress. You communicate priorities when you say no to things, and you communicate priorities in how you spend your time. I really like to use data to tell a story. If you can measure something, you can use that measurement as a metric and an indicator of success. But because you manage what you measure, right, you need to be careful that you consider the experience holistically, like maybe using multiple metrics to balance it out. And so in the first half of this year, the top priority for my team was a project we called Open Sesame. And we communicated why it was a project using 2 main metrics. The first one was user success rate with the action, which was not as high as it should be. And the second was support volume from users trying to achieve this action, which was way higher than it should have been. And these 2 numbers showed up every time we discussed it, and they still show up today. They show up in our bi-monthly What Are We Doing post, they show up in our What This Project Is post, and I bring them up every time we talk about it. And then we use user testing videos of users really struggling to complete this action to round out the numbers and to kind of help engineers empathize with the problem and the people it affects. So it's important to align your actions with priorities. I started managing a designer this year for the first time ever, and I had no idea how to manage a designer, so you'll never guess what happened. I screwed up. And the way that I screwed up was that I kept asking him to weigh in on things that, I thought were really small, as he tried to make progress on this highest priority project for our team. And so it turns out that the things that I thought were like the design equivalent of code review were not. They were much more work than I had any idea of. And so as I paid attention, I realized that this was stressing him out, and then we talked about it, aligned his work so we could let that kind of stuff wait for a while so that he could focus on our top team priority. So one thing that can be a challenge for mobile teams in particular is that right now Android is the largest and the growth platform. And depending on what you're building and your market, Android might not be your biggest platform, but it's definitely an important one. And if you talk about how Android is important, but you only file iOS bugs, people will get the message that iOS is more important, whatever it is that you're saying. So on a connected team, people work together and take an interest in each other. This doesn't mean that everybody has to be friends, just that they're friendly. But the problem on mobile that we have is that we lack a clear model for mobile infrastructure. And so then we have these endless discussions like, should we have a mobile team or should we have product pods? I think regardless of what your org looks like, product pods, mobile team, some new configuration that has not yet been think-pieced on Medium, you have a challenge of connection. In a dedicated mobile team, how do mobile engineers connect with engineers working on front-end features? Or the engineers developing the API. Was the API developed with mobile in mind, or does it, work on somebody else's machine? And often the answer to this is product pods, right? Which is not a bad answer. People have been known to build APIs that actually work well for mobile this way. But a good app is not just a collection of features, it is an architected thing that has components that are shared throughout. Some notion of user identity, a networking layer, a database. Ideally it follows some standard patterns that are, I'm going to get really radical here, possible to write tests for. It's also going to need to be mindful of memory management because mobile is a constrained experience, not just by screen size. So the first raccoon says to the second raccoon, I've split the application up into 7 microservices. And the second raccoon says, so you have 7 teams that hate each other. And the first raccoon says, how did you know? Now, to be clear, this isn't a good way to run any team, but there is no microservices architecture for mobile. Whatever your setup, people are going to have to, I'm going to get super radical here, talk to each other. And when you organize teams to better facilitate one kind of communication, you make other kinds of communication harder. There's no way for one team's architectural decisions not to affect the rest of the people working on the app. Bonus, we're still really evolving our patterns and standards for architecting complex mobile applications. It's not really currently a concept of a mobile infrastructure engineer. So we can't make people like each other. So now what? Well, the best way to get 2 teams to fight is to give them conflicting incentives. So if you incentivize one team to ship maximum features as fast as you can and another team to maintain 0 crashes, you can just sit back with some popcorn and enjoy the show. But if you incentivize one team to, say, improve metrics around user engagement and another team to maintain sustainable execution, then it's probably going to look a lot less like robot wars and a lot more like a functional work environment. Now, if your app is badly architected, everyone will pay for that every day. If your networking code is a mess, it will bleed through your entire application. If you invest in the things that should make everyone more productive, then everyone will probably be more productive. But these things can kind of be harder to justify to product and business, but every team gets some kind of maintenance time, and the thing is to be strategic about how you use it. Now, the easiest way to build a team is to unite against a common enemy. But this is a short-term strategy and not conducive to long or even, medium-term good work environments. Your team is not just the one denoted by the org chart. A team is a group of people who work together to achieve a common goal. So if you ignore the org chart for a minute and think about something you're trying to achieve, who's on your team? Who do you need on your team to be successful? And then you can reach out to them. Now, let's talk about automation. This might seem like an out-of-place thing in this talk, predictable, prioritized, connected, automated, accountable even, these are all fuzzy people things, right? But automation sounds like more fun, like proper developer work. So here's the thing about automation. It's like documentation, but developers might actually write it. So without automation, it's really easy to have random things that few people know how to do. It's a lot harder for other people to take over processes like builds. And a lot of time gets spent on manual processes that are straightforward to reproduce, like basic Q&A. And either bugs get missed because this is inconsistent, or it's just time that could be better spent on more complex things like complex scenario testing. So what should we automate? Well, first, automate builds. Like seriously, if you commit to predictable releases, you will end up in investing in automation to maintain that process, because otherwise it's just too painful. So there can be a chicken and egg problem here, where one thing I've noticed is like one of the big pushbacks on regular releases is that we don't have enough automation yet. But I say nothing kind of incentivizes automation more than committing to the predictable release and like really feeling that pain. Write tests. I can't believe I'm still trying to convince people to write tests in 2017. But frankly, there are a lot of things that I can't believe about 2017. And one of my current work hobbies is noticing GitHub threads with very clear testing instructions and saying, this would make a good test. Other common GitHub comments from me: please add some tests. I like these tests. It's, positive reinforcement is good. It's important to note with testing that testing is really not just a question of writing tests, but also about architecting things in such a way that you actually can write tests. Add linting. I believe in style guides, and the main purpose of a style guide is this: we have a style guide so that we never need to discuss it again. I once witnessed a centi-thread argument about whether it should be const equals var or var equals const, and that's like a chunk of my life I'll never get back. Who has time for that kind of nonsense, right? Have a style guide, automate it so that Xcode and Android Studio apply it automatically. Have your code review system show any deviations so that your reviewers don't have to. Code review done well is a great collaboration tool. But in a dysfunctional environment, code review is basically the first place that conflict will show up. And, one positive, but let's be clear, insufficient step towards productive code review is automating like lint checks so that you eliminate nonsense arguments about spacing. So tooling on mobile is still behind, but it is getting better. Things can be a bit more painful to set up, but if you make the time, it does pay off. And part of it is having that time. When everything is really frantic, there's no time to automate painful things to make them better. And the anti-pattern of automation is over-automation. I'm sure you've worked with people, maybe some of you have been that person, who, craft some elaborate system to, address some very minor problem that only they can see. And pragmatically with automation, it's about taking the most painful, the most tedious, hard to socialize tasks and making them easier. So on an accountable team, people can have expectations of each other, and this includes leadership. But the problem is that the other things that we've discussed can, result in mobile being a bit disconnected. Server-side changes can break clients, and then the mobile team takes the heat from users and from leadership. This can lead to resentment, which makes accountability really hard. And accountability comes last because it builds on everything else. Being erratic undermines accountability because the chaos can always be blamed. Lack of prioritization undermines accountability because, who's to say what was most important? On a disconnected non-team, who even is accountable and for what? And the less a team is automated, the more crucial but repetitive things can just fall through the cracks. So if you want to hold somebody accountable, assuming that you're not a sociopath, it needs to be clear what you're holding them accountable for. But you individually holding people accountable just doesn't scale. In a healthy team, people will hold themselves accountable to their team. Now, the worst manager I ever had, he hit deadlines and concealed missing deadlines until eventually, and surprisingly, the team and products were killed. And one time I told him I was worried that we were missing this deadline, and he said, "What deadline? There was no deadline." There was a deadline. And he made it impossible for other people to know what was going on because he just discouraged any communication that wasn't to him. And so no one on the team could really hold anyone else accountable because nobody knew what was going on. So it was really kind of farcical, but the best way to tell that there had been a deadline was that the tech lead on the project would disappear. And so one time we missed a deadline and he disappeared for 3 days to search for his cat. I'm not kidding, this really happened. So we had this meeting, like a postmortem about like why the team couldn't ship anything, and this tech lead like made these like subtle digs at people on the team, and then he made this really inappropriate remark to me, and everyone sat there in silence, and then later told me they were appalled. So my manager was in the meeting, but he didn't handle it. And I told him I was not okay with it, and I kind of expected him to do something about it. I used to be like optimistic. And he just told me like, well, you should handle that yourself. And so he never said this about minor things, this guy did, but when he did something that inappropriate, he was like, good luck. I'm kidding, he didn't even say good luck, he just said that's for you to deal with. So this is probably what we should expect from a guy who dealt with deadlines by pretending they didn't exist, right? So I got this dude one-on-one, and I told him everything he'd done to annoy me for like the past 6 months, why what he'd just done was totally inappropriate, and I shared with him my conclusion, which is that he had no leadership skills. So you might be surprised to learn that this did not go well. Right? Shocker. Now, in my defense, I was right. This guy had spent 4 months reinventing how to build an Android app, and then 8 months doing UI fixes before we finally shipped. I think this was like 6 months into that period. And the project he led was a complete disaster. And when that became clear, he disappeared for 3 days to search for his cat. So like really somebody needed to tell this guy that he was doing a really poor job. But I was not the right person to do it. So for one thing, I was very angry. I was furious. For the second thing, I was trying to hold him accountable for something that he hadn't agreed to be accountable for on a team with no culture or norms of accountability. And I wasn't starting with a small thing, right? Like I was starting with a crisis. And this is not how you start to build a culture of accountability, It's not when you go like, wow, I do not want to deal with that. You have to start smaller. First, you have to hold yourself accountable. And second, you have to encourage people to own up and create space for them to do so. And third, you have to create ways where team members can hold each other accountable. Now, when we move into leadership, it's really easy for our work to become less visible. The output is the team, it's no longer individual. And good leadership and management, these are both a lot of work, but often it's kind of nebulous and harder to surface. If our work's too visible, it's likely that we're taking credit for things that are done by the entire team. And often we demonstrate accountability one-on-one. We set one-on-one meetings and we show up to them. We listen to what people say and we follow up on it, even if we can't fix it right now. So now that my work is more meta, I write this internal blog post every week where I share the things that I've spent time on and often less concrete things that I'm just thinking about. And when I was a manager of ICs, I just used to post my stand-up every day the same as everyone else. And sometimes it'd be pretty boring, like one-on-ones, code review, if I'm lucky. But I find being transparent about how I spend my time goes a long way, even if my outputs aren't as clear anymore. And you can't make somebody hold themselves accountable, but you can encourage accountability. So I think stand-up is a really good way to do this, and I really like tech stand-ups on Slack. Stand-up forces someone to start their day with some kind of attention about what they want to achieve in it. And you can invite accountability by asking people to share over longer periods what they hope to accomplish and giving them space to surface when things didn't go to plan. You can also invite accountability by asking questions before giving feedback or assigning blame. It's much more powerful when somebody owns up to something they need to do better than when you need to tell them. Now, code review done well is such a good entry point into peer accountability because this is where people look at each other's work and ask hard questions and give feedback. And how do you get accountability outside of code review? Well, a lot of that's about encouraging a non-judgmental space where people can be open about what hasn't gone to plan. There's nothing more toxic to a culture of accountability than blame. Only when people feel like they can own up to each other and will they be able to ask questions of each other without fear of seeming judgmental. So the big thing I want you to take away is this overarching idea of thinking in the medium term. Short-term thinking comes back to bite us very quickly, and long-term thinking optimizes for a future that we'll probably never get to. A lot of what we've covered is about like mindful investment in the important rather than the perfection of everything, both in what we build but also in how we go about it. And this is also about doing the hard thing. There are no silver bullets because a team is a complex system and everything affects everything else. So I'm going to wrap with 2 observations that I regularly make to newer managers finding things hard. And so the first is congratulations on not being a sociopath. It's amazing that people ever ask me for advice, honestly. But a lot of hard things, hard conversations, hard decisions where you have to disappoint somebody, these are hard and there's a limit to how easy they should be. If something's hard, it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be doing it. It might just mean that you're not a sociopath. And the second is, this is why most teams are dysfunctional. Because most people don't do this work. So this has been a soft talk, and I hate that phrase because humans are so much harder than machines. But it's also been a works on my machine talk. Because the thing that I have not touched upon here is the amount of work that I've done on myself to be able to serve my team to this extent. This work is really emotionally hard and draining, and the easiest way to set yourself up for failure is not to take care of yourself so that you can't sustain it. Healthy teams are made up of healthy people. So we take care of ourselves so we can take care of each other, because together we can ride a whole family of crocodiles, or at least steal a car. Thank you.